Strip down to your undergarments. Now, the words hung in the California air like smoke from a dying fire. 30 Japanese women stood frozen in the dust, their eyes fixed on the ground, their hands clutching what remained of their uniforms. Nurses, clerks, radio operators, women who had believed with the certainty of gospel that surrender meant only one thing: a slow death dressed in shame. Grace Nakamura stood in the third row, her fingers wrapped around a small wooden charm from Kyoto, smooth from years of touch, worn thin by prayers whispered in the dark. She had pressed this talisman against the chests of dying men in field hospitals across the Pacific. She had held it through bombing raids in Manila. She had clutched it during the long march to the prison transport that brought them here to this place the Americans called Camp Stoneheart, though no one had explained why it carried such a name. The charm felt cold now, empty of whatever protection it once promised. Grace was 28 years old. She had seen men die from infected wounds because there was no medicine. She had watched soldiers bleed out on operating tables made from stacked ammunition crates. She had held the hands of boys who called for their mothers in voices that grew quieter and quieter until they stopped calling at all. But she had never felt fear quite like this. The sun beat down without mercy. August in Northern California burned different from the tropical heat of the Philippines. Drier, sharper, the kind of heat that made breathing feel like swallowing sand. Around her, the other women trembled. Some were crying silently. Others stared straight ahead with the blank expression of people who had already left their bodies, who had retreated somewhere deep inside where the world could not follow. Grace knew what they were all thinking. The propaganda had been clear, explicit. Americans were monsters. They would violate Japanese women. They would strip away dignity before they stripped away life. Surrender was worse than death. Surrender was eternal dishonor. But what choice had they been given? The war was over. Japan had fallen. The emperor himself had spoken the words no one thought they would ever hear. We must bear the unbearable. We must endure the unendurable. So they endured. They surrendered. They marched in silence through jungle paths and then onto transport ships that reeked of fuel and fear. They ate rice that tasted like rust. They slept in cargo holds where the walls sweated condensation that never dried. And now they stood here in this dusty California camp hearing words that confirmed their worst nightmares. Strip. Now, an American guard stood 10 paces away, young, sunburned. His uniform marked him as Army, though Grace did not know the American ranks well enough to guess his position. He did not shout. He did not sneer. He simply pointed toward a canvas tent, his face expressionless, as if this were nothing more than another duty before dinner. That bewildered her more than cruelty would have. Grace glanced to her left. Mari Tanaka stood there, barely 22, looking even younger in the harsh light. The girl's hands shook so badly she could hardly keep hold of her own uniform. Mari had been a clerk, a recorder. She had beautiful handwriting, they said. Perfect characters that flowed like water across paper. Someone in the Naval Military Police had noticed that talent and decided it was useful. Grace had met Mari only 3 weeks ago during the transport from Manila. They had not spoken much. Mari kept to herself, always staring at nothing, always flinching at sudden sounds. But Grace had noticed something else. The way Mari's eyes would dart toward the guards whenever they passed. The way she would touch her right thigh through her skirt, as if checking that something was still there, or perhaps hoping it had disappeared. Now, as the command to strip echoed across the compound, Mari looked like she might collapse. Grace reached out and touched the girl's elbow. Just a light pressure, enough to say you are not alone. Mari turned, and for just a moment their eyes met. In that glance, Grace saw something she recognized from field hospitals. The look of someone carrying a wound no one else could see. Then footsteps approached from behind the canvas tent. The nurse, she was tall, broad-shouldered. Her hair blonde and pulled back tight caught the sunlight in a way that seemed almost violent in its brightness. She wore an American military uniform, khaki, impressed with sleeves rolled to the elbows. Her name tag read CPL Parker. Corporal, Grace knew that much English. Lieutenant Sarah Parker Grace would learn later. Though at this moment she was simply the American woman, walking toward them with a clipboard in one hand and a small brown bottle in the other. The women stiffened. Sarah stopped a few paces away and surveyed them with eyes the color of winter sky. Cold, assessing, but not cruel. That was the strange part. Grace had expected hatred in the eyes of her captors. She had expected disgust. What she saw instead was something clinical, professional, the same expression she herself wore when examining a patient when emotion had to be set aside so the work could be done. Sarah spoke. The words were English incomprehensible, but her tone was matter of fact. A translator stepped forward from the group of guards, an older man with gray at his temples. Japanese-American Grace realized. His accent was strange, shaped by years in America, but understandable. You will be examined for infections. It is required for tropical disease control. Geneva Convention Protocol. The words should have been reassuring. They were not, because protocol and cruelty often wore the same uniform. Grace watched as Sarah gestured toward the tent. One by one she indicated. The translator repeated the instruction. Grace was fourth in line. She watched the first three women disappear into the tent and emerge minutes later, their faces unreadable, their movements careful as if they had been broken and badly reassembled. When Grace's turn came, she walked forward on legs that felt disconnected from her body. Inside the tent, the air was stifling. It smelled of iodine and bleach and something organic and unpleasant that Grace recognized as the scent of infection. Jungle rot. She had treated it 100 times. The flesh turning white and soft fungus blooming in the spaces between toes and the creases behind knees. It thrived in humidity in the places where skin stayed damp too long. Sarah stood beside a makeshift examination table. A medic waited nearby, a younger man, who kept his eyes carefully averted, focusing on the supplies laid out on a metal tray. Bandages, iodine, scissors, tweezers. Sarah gestured. The translator spoke. Raise your skirt above your knees. Grace hesitated. Her hands moved as if controlled by someone else. Slowly she gathered the fabric and lifted. Her legs were streaked with mud and insect bites. Dark patches marked where jungle rot had taken hold during the weeks in the Philippine swamps. She had tried to treat herself, but without proper medicine, there was little to be done except keep the wounds dry, and even that had been impossible. Sarah crouched down. Her movements were precise. She examined Grace's legs without touching, at first simply looking, cataloging. Then she reached for a cotton swab, dipped it in iodine, and began cleaning the worst of the infections. The sting was immediate and intense. Grace bit the inside of her cheek to keep from crying out. Sarah's hands were steady, gentle even. She worked with the efficiency of someone who had done this 1,000 times. After a moment, she spoke without looking up. This will hurt, but it will heal. The translator repeated the words. Grace almost laughed. Almost, because pain and healing had long ago stopped being separate things in her mind. When Sarah finished, she pressed a small tin of ointment into Grace's palm. The label was in English, meaningless to Grace's eyes, but Sarah gestured in a way that communicated clearly. Apply twice daily. Grace bowed. It was instinct, habit, years of training that said respect must be shown even to enemies. Sarah blinked, surprised. Then after a pause, she nodded once in return. Grace left the tent and stood in the sunlight waiting as the other women went through the same examination. One by one they emerged, silent, processing, trying to understand what had just happened. Where was the cruelty? Where was the violation? They had been told Americans were monsters, and yet here was something that looked almost like care. The mark Mari Tanaka was 23rd in line. Grace watched the girl approach the tent entrance. Mari's movements were stiff, mechanical, as if her body had forgotten how to walk. At the threshold, she stopped completely, one hand gripping the canvas flap so tightly her knuckles went white. The translator called to her. Mari, step forward. But she did not move. Sarah appeared at the tent entrance. She looked at Mari for a long moment, her expression unreadable, and then spoke in a softer tone. The translator rendered it gently. It is only an examination. You will not be harmed. Mari's lips moved, but no sound came out. Finally, as if every muscle in her body had to be convinced separately, she stepped inside. Grace counted seconds. 30, 60, 90. When Mari finally emerged, her face was the color of ash. She walked past Grace without seeing her, moving like a woman in a dream, or perhaps a nightmare from which she could not wake. She sat down in the dust a few meters away, pulled her knees to her chest, and stared at nothing. Something had happened. Grace was certain of it. But what the examinations continued through the afternoon. By the time the last woman finished, the sun hung low over the western hills, painting the camp in shades of amber and rust. The women were led to another tent, this one longer, and lined with rows of narrow cots covered in thin mattresses and mosquito netting. Their barracks for however long this imprisonment would last. Grace found a cot near the back and sat down carefully, testing the springs. They creaked but held. Round her, the other women were doing the same, each claiming a small space in this temporary world. Some unpacked what little they had carried: a photograph, a letter, a piece of cloth that had once been part of something meaningful. Grace had only the wooden charm. She set it on the edge of the cot and stared at it, a gift from her father before he left for the war in China. 1930, she had been 16. He had pressed it into her hand and said, "Keep this with you always. It will bring you home." But where was home now? Japan was defeated. Cities were rubble. The emperor's voice on the radio had been small and distant, nearly swallowed by static. Everything they had believed in, everything they had been told, was sacred and unbreakable, had shattered in an instant. And Grace's father, she had received no word of him since 1942. Missing in action, they said. Somewhere in Manchuria, likely dead, though no one would confirm it. Just missing, which meant he existed in a strange liminal space between grief and hope. Grace touched the charm. It was warm from being held, but it offered no comfort. Across the barracks, Amari sat on her cot with her back against the wall, staring at her hands as if they belonged to someone else. Grace stood, walked over, sat down on the edge of Mari's cot without asking permission. The girl did not look up. For a long time they sat in silence. Outside, the sounds of the camp settled into evening rhythms. Guards changing shifts. The distant clatter of mess hall preparations. A generator humming somewhere close by, powering lights that were just beginning to flicker on against the gathering darkness. Finally, Grace spoke. "What happened in there?" Mari did not answer immediately. When she did, her voice was barely audible. "Nothing. That is not true." Mari's hands clenched into fists. She closed her eyes. A single tear traced down her cheek, catching the dim light. She saw something. Who? The nurse. Lieutenant Parker. She saw the mark on my leg. Grace's pulse quickened. What mark? Mari shook her head. "I cannot tell you." "Then why mention it at all?" "Because," Mari whispered, "you will find out soon enough. Everyone will." Grace wanted to press to demand answers, but something in Mari's expression stopped her. This was a girl balancing on the edge of something terrible. Push too hard, and she would fall. So instead, Grace said, "I will not ask again. But if you need help, I am here." Mari looked at her, then really looked at her, and for a moment Grace saw past the fear to something else. Gratitude, maybe. Or desperation. "Thank you," Mari whispered. Then she turned her face to the wall and said nothing more. The storm, night fell over Camp Stoneheart with the weight of a physical thing. The temperature dropped fast. Grace lay beneath a thin blanket on her cot, listening to the sounds of women trying to sleep. Soft crying from somewhere near the front. Whispered prayers in Japanese. The rustle of bodies shifting, searching for comfort that did not exist. Grace could not sleep. Her mind kept returning to Mari's words. The mark. What kind of mark? And why did it matter so much that Lieutenant Parker had seen it? She thought about the way Sarah's eyes had narrowed during Grace's own examination. Not with judgment, with recognition, as if she had been looking for something specific and found it on someone else. Through the mosquito netting, Grace could see the faint glow of lights from another tent across the compound. The medical station, she guessed. And there, silhouetted against the canvas, was a figure moving back and forth, sorting supplies, making notes, working long after everyone else had stopped. Lieutenant Sarah Parker. Grace watched that silhouette for a long time, trying to understand. Then the rain came. It started as a whisper against the canvas roof, a soft pattering that almost sounded gentle, but within minutes it transformed into something violent, a roar that drowned out every other sound. Water hammered the tent so hard it seemed the fabric might tear. The ground outside turned to mud that smelled like rust and old earth. By morning, half the camp was sick, coughing, fever, the kind of illness that spread fast in close quarters where bodies were already weakened by malnutrition and stress. Grace woke to the sound of retching from the far end of the barracks. She sat up, medical instincts kicking in automatically, and looked around. Mari's cot was empty. Grace stood quickly, pulling on her damp clothes. She moved down the row of cots, checking faces, but Mari was not there. Outside, rain still fell in sheets. Grace stepped into it, immediately soaked, and scanned the compound. There, near the medical tent, a figure collapsed in the mud. Grace ran. Mari lay on her side unconscious, her skin burning with fever even through the cold rain. Grace rolled her over and immediately saw the problem. The girl's right thigh was swollen, the fabric of her uniform pants stained with something dark that was not mud. Infection. Bad. Grace shouted for help. Within seconds, 2 American medics appeared. They lifted Mari between them and carried her into the medical tent. Grace followed without being asked, without permission, driven by something stronger than fear of consequences. Inside, Lieutenant Sarah Parker stood at a table already pulling on surgical gloves. Her eyes met Grace's for a fraction of a second, a flash of something that might have been respect, and then she focused entirely on Mari. The medics laid Mari on the examination table. Sarah cut away the uniform pants with scissors, exposing the infected wound. It was worse than Grace had feared. The flesh was angry, red, swollen, tight with white patches blooming at the edges. Tropical rot accelerated by neglect and humidity. Sarah worked quickly. She poured iodine over the wound, the liquid running pink with blood and pus. Mari stirred, moaning in pain but not waking. Sarah's hands moved with practiced precision, cleaning, probing, assessing. Then she stopped. Her fingers had brushed against something. She looked closer, wiping away more of the infection. And there, just visible beneath the damaged skin, was a mark, small, faded, blurred by time and sweat and fear, but unmistakable. A symbol, ink pressed into flesh years ago. Not a tattoo exactly, more like an identification mark, the kind that certain military units used for internal tracking. Grace saw it, Sarah saw it, and in that moment something passed between them that had no words. Sarah's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She glanced at the medic standing nearby, a young corporal who was busy organizing bandages and seemed not to have noticed. Then Sarah pulled fresh gauze over the mark, covering it completely, as if it were nothing more than damaged skin requiring protection. She wrote something on her clipboard. Grace could not read English well enough to make out the words, but the categories were clear. Patient name, diagnosis, treatment plan. The mark was not mentioned. Sarah looked up then and spoke directly to Grace, not to the translator. "I need assistance." Grace understood the tone, if not the words. She stepped forward. Together they cleaned the wound. Sarah made a shallow incision to drain the infection. Pus spilled out, mixing with iodine into something that smelled like death. Mari whimpered but did not wake. Sarah worked with steady hands, clearing away dead tissue, applying antibiotics from a small vial, suturing carefully. Through it all, Grace assisted without needing instruction. "Hand me that. Hold this. Apply pressure here." The language of medicine was universal, written in gestures and necessity rather than words. When it was finished, Sarah bandaged the wound and stepped back. She looked at Grace with eyes that held a question. Or maybe a warning. "She will need watching tonight," Sarah said. The translator had appeared at some point and rendered the words into Japanese. "You have medical training." "Yes," Grace answered. 4 years, field hospitals in the Philippines and China." Sarah nodded slowly. "Then you will stay with her." It was not a request. Grace pulled a chair beside Mari's cot and sat down. Outside, the rain began to ease, tapering from a roar to a steady drumming. The camp settled into an uneasy quiet. Sarah worked at the other end of the tent, organizing supplies that had been scattered by the storm. Her movements were methodical, almost mechanical, but Grace noticed the way her hands trembled slightly when she thought no one was watching. Hours passed. Mari slept fitfully, her fever spiking and then breaking as the antibiotics took hold. Grace dozed in the chair, jerking awake every time Mari stirred. Sometime after midnight, Mari's eyes opened. She stared at the canvas ceiling for a long moment, as if trying to remember where she was. Then her gaze found Grace. "She saw it," Mari whispered. "Did she not?" Grace did not pretend to misunderstand. "Yes." "And she covered it." "Yes." Mari's eyes filled with tears. "Why, I do not know." Mari turned her head away. "There are things I recorded, names, places, villages, things I wish I could forget." Grace leaned closer. What kind of things? But Mari had closed her eyes again, retreating back into sleep or something like it. Grace sat back, her mind racing. She thought about the mark, about Sarah's reaction, about the way the lieutenant had deliberately omitted it from the medical records. Protection. That was what it looked like. But why would an American officer protect a Japanese prisoner's secrets, unless those secrets were dangerous to more than just Mari? Grace looked across the tent to where Sarah stood near the supply cabinet, her back to the room. In the lamplight, her shadow stretched long and dark across the canvas wall. Two women, one holding a secret that could destroy her, the other choosing to keep that secret hidden. But for how long and at what call outside the rain finally stopped? In the silence that followed, Grace could hear Mari's breathing slow and steady. Now the crisis passed, but another kind of storm was building, one that had nothing to do with weather, and Grace could feel it coming. The kindness. 3 days after the storm, something stranger than cruelty arrived at Camp Stoneheart. Breakfast. Grace stood in line at the mess tent holding a dented metal tray that smelled faintly of soap and rust. Around her, the other women shuffled forward in silence, eyes downcast, expecting the thin rice gruel they had grown accustomed to. The kind that was more water than grain, the kind that left your stomach feeling emptier than before you ate. But when Grace reached the serving station, an American cook ladled something else onto her tray. Scrambled eggs, pale yellow and still steaming. 2 strips of bacon, dark and glistening with fat. A slice of bread thick and white with a pat of butter melting into its surface. Grace stared at the food as if it might be a hallucination. Beside her, Mari made a small sound that might have been a gap or a sob. The girl's hands shook as she held her own tray. "Is this," Mari whispered. "Is this pork?" The cook, a heavy-set man with graying temples and kind eyes, did not understand Japanese. But he saw the confusion on their faces and smiled. Not a cruel smile, not mocking. Just tired kindness from someone who had served too many meals in too many camps. "Eat up, ladies," he said in English they could not comprehend. "Lord knows you need it." They sat at one of the long wooden tables. Around them, other women were having the same stunned reaction. Some were crying silently as they ate. Others simply stared at their food, unable to reconcile what they had been told about Americans with what was happening in front of them. Grace picked up the bacon with her fingers. It was still warm. The fat had crystallized at the edges into something crispy and fragile. She bit into it. The taste exploded across her tongue. Salt and smoke and richness unlike anything she had eaten in years. Not since before the war, when her family could still afford meat. Even then, pork had been a luxury reserved for special occasions. New Year, festivals, days that mattered. This was just Tuesday morning in an American prison camp. Grace closed her eyes. For a moment, she was 16 again, sitting at her family's table in Osaka, her father laughing at something her brother had said, her mother bringing out a dish of braised pork belly that made the whole house smell like celebration. Then she opened her eyes and remembered where she was. Across the table, Mari had not touched her food. She stared at the bacon as if it were evidence of something she could not quite name. Her lips moved silently, forming words that never became sound. "You should eat," Grace said gently. "You need your strength." "Why are they being kind to us?" Mari's voice was barely a whisper. "What do they want?" Grace had no answer. She took another bite of bacon and tried not to think about it too much, because thinking led to questions, and questions led to the uncomfortable realization that maybe, just maybe, they had been lied to about more than just the war. A shadow fell across their table. Grace looked up and to find Private Tommy Sullivan standing there, a gangly boy with red hair and freckles that stood out starkly against his sunburned face. He could not have been more than 19. Maybe younger. He held a canteen in one hand and a small paper bag in the other. For a moment, he just stood there, shifting his weight from foot to foot, clearly uncomfortable. Then he set the bag on the table between Grace and Mari and backed away quickly as if afraid they might bite. Mari reached for the bag with trembling hands. Inside were 2 chocolate bars. American brand. Hershey's, the wrapper said in blocky letters. Tommy was already walking away. His shoulders hunched, his neck red with embarrassment or shame, or perhaps both. Grace watched him go and felt something crack inside her chest, something that had been holding tight for a very long time. They had been told Americans were monsters. They had been told surrender meant violation and death. They had prepared themselves for the worst humanity could offer. Instead, they got bacon and chocolate from a boy who looked like he might cry if he thought about it too long, the waiting. The days that followed established a rhythm. Wake at dawn, roll call in the dusty yard, breakfast at the mess tent, where each morning brought food that seemed excessive, wasteful even by Japanese standards. Eggs every day, meat most days, bread that was soft instead of hard, coffee that tasted bitter and strange, but that some of the women were starting to crave. After breakfast, there was nothing. No work assignments, no labor details, just waiting. The women sat in the barracks or wandered the small area they were permitted to access. Some tried to wash clothes in buckets of cold water. Others sat in the sun and stared at nothing. Mari recovered slowly from the infection. The wound on her thigh scabbed over pink and angry, but no longer spreading. Lieutenant Sarah Parker checked it every other day. Her examinations quick and professional, her eyes carefully avoiding the faded mark that lay just beyond the damaged tissue. Grace always accompanied Mari to these appointments. Sarah never asked her to leave. It became an unspoken arrangement. The three of them in the medical tent, Sarah cleaning the wound, Grace handing her supplies. Mari sitting very still and quiet, as if movement might break whatever fragile protection she had been granted. They did not speak except about medical matters, infection status, healing progress, whether the antibiotics needed to continue. But Grace felt the weight of unspoken things in that tent, questions that pressed against her teeth but never escaped. Who are you protecting her from? What will happen when the wound fully heals and these examinations stop? What did you see in that mark that made you choose silence one afternoon nearly a week after the storm? Grace noticed something. Lieutenant Parker's hands were shaking, just slightly, just enough to make the tweezers rattle against the metal tray when she set them down. Sarah noticed Grace noticing and immediately clasped her hands together, pressing them against her thighs until the trembling stopped. Their eyes met, held. In that moment, Grace understood something fundamental. Sarah Parker was not just protecting Marie, she was protecting herself. Whatever secret that mark represented, it was dangerous to everyone who knew about it, even the Americans. The announcement. The notice appeared on the fourth Monday of their captivity. It was posted outside the medical tent in both English and awkwardly translated Japanese. Grace read it twice, trying to make sense of the words. All prisoners will be photographed for identification. Required by Red Cross International Documentation Protocols. Photographs will be taken beginning Tuesday, 0900 hours. Attendance mandatory. Around her, the women gathered to read the same notice. Their reactions ranged from confusion to fear. One older woman, a former radio operator named Keiko, actually laughed, a bitter sound like breaking glass. Photographs, Keiko said. As if we are criminals. We are prisoners of war, Grace replied. I suppose to them it is the same thing, but some women saw it differently. They clung to the idea that a photograph might reach home, that it might serve as proof they had survived, that somewhere in the ruins of Japan a family member might see their face and know they were still alive. Mari said nothing. She stood apart from the group, her arms wrapped around herself, staring at the notice as if it had personally threatened her. That night, Grace found Mari sitting on her cot long after the lamps had been turned down. The girl was running her fingers over the healing wound on her thigh, over and over, a nervous gesture that made Grace's chest tighten. It is just a photograph, Grace said, sitting down beside her. Mari's laugh was hollow. Nothing is just anything anymore. What do you mean? Mari turned to look at her in the darkness. A photograph is evidence. Proof I existed. Proof I was here. If the wrong people see it, if they recognize me from before what? Before I knew too much. Grace wanted to press, to demand answers, but she had learned that Mari could not be pushed. She could only be waited for. So Grace sat in silence, and eventually Mari continued. There were files in Manchuria, names of people who were taken, villages that were emptied. I wrote them down because that was my job. Beautiful characters on clean paper. I thought I was helping keep records. Proper documentation. Order. Mari's voice cracked. I did not know what the records were for. Not until later. Not until I saw what happened to those villages, to those names. Grace felt cold despite the warmth of the California night. What did you do? I copied some of the lists, just a few pages. I do not even know why. Maybe because I thought someone should remember. Someone should know what we did. We, Japan, the Army, all of us. Grace absorbed this carefully. You kept copies I tried, but they are gone now, lost when I was captured. So maybe it does not matter anymore. But you remember. Mari nodded slowly. I remember everything. Every name. Every village. Sometimes I think that is my punishment. To remember what I was supposed to forget. Silence fell between them. Outside, a guard walked past on patrol, his boots crunching in the gravel. The sound faded into distance. The photograph, Grace said finally. You think someone might recognize you, if it reaches the right people, or the wrong people. Either way, I am not safe. I will never be safe. Grace wanted to offer comfort, to say that Mari was worrying over nothing, that no one cared about the records of a junior clerk in a defeated army, but she could not make herself believe it. And she would not lie to this frightened girl who had already been lied to enough. So instead, she said, I will stand with you tomorrow when they take the photograph. Mari looked at her with eyes that shone wet in the darkness. Why would you do that? Because you should not have to face it alone. It could make you dangerous too, by association. Grace thought about that, about the calculations of safety and risk that survival demanded. Then she thought about her father's wooden charm, about the prayers she had whispered over dying men, about all the ways war turned people into things they never thought they would become. I am already dangerous, Grace said. We all are. We survived. The session, Tuesday morning, arrived clear and hot. The women lined up in the yard where a sheet had been hung against the barracks wall. White canvas stretched tight. A camera stood on a tripod like some strange mechanical bird. The photographer, an American corporal with a face burnt red by the sun, adjusted dials and checked light meters, humming a tune Grace did not recognize. Lieutenant Sarah Parker stood nearby with her eternal clipboard. She wore her uniform crisp as always, her hair pulled back so tight it seemed to pull at her temples. But Grace saw the tension in her shoulders, the way her eyes kept drifting to the spot where Mari waited near the back of the line. The photography began. One by one, women stepped forward, gave their names to the translator, stood against the white sheet. The camera flashed bright and violent, leaving spots in Grace's vision even from meters away. Some women flinched. Others stared straight ahead with blank expressions. A few tried to smile as if this were a normal photograph for a normal purpose, as if they could pretend their way back to a world where pictures meant memories instead of documentation. Grace counted. 15 women photographed, then 16. 17, Mari was 23rd in line. As the number approached, Grace watched the girl's breathing grow shallow and fast. Her hands clenched and unclenched. Her eyes darted toward the perimeter fence as if calculating the possibility of escape. Then the photographer called the name. Tanaka Mari. Mari did not move. The translator repeated it. Tanaka Mari. Step forward, please. Still nothing. The line behind her shuffled uncomfortably. The photographer lowered his camera and looked to Lieutenant Parker with a question in his eyes. Sarah walked forward, her boots leaving small puffs of dust with each step. She stopped directly in front of Mari. You must step forward, Sarah said. The translator rendered the words gently. Mari's lips moved, but no sound emerged. Her entire body had gone rigid. It is required, Sarah continued. Her voice was softer now, almost kind. I cannot excuse you. Mari took a single step, then stopped. Her breath came in short gasps. I cannot, she whispered. I cannot. You can, you must. But Mari shook her head and Grace saw tears beginning to streak down the girl's face. Grace moved without thinking. She stepped out of line and walked to Mari's side. She took the girl's hand. It was cold despite the heat. I will go with you, Grace said. Sarah's eyes flicked to Grace. For a moment, something passed between them. A question, an answer. Then Sarah gave a tight nod. Together, Grace and Mari walked to the white sheet. They stood side by side. Grace kept hold of Mari's hand and felt the trembling that ran through the girl's entire body. The photographer raised the camera, adjusted the lens. Ready. Grace squeezed Mari's hand. The flash came like lightning, white and blinding and absolute. Mari recoiled as if struck. Her knees buckled. Grace caught her, holding her upright by sheer force of will. Jesus Christ, the photographer muttered. Lieutenant Parker was there in an instant. She took Mari's other arm, and together they guided her away from the sheet, away from the camera, away from the white light that had done what violence could not. Mari collapsed onto the ground, her breath coming in sobs, her hands covering her face. Sarah knelt beside her. Grace did the same. The rest of the women watched in silence. "Breathe," Sarah said quietly. "Just breathe." But Mari could not seem to find air. She gasped and choked and trembled like something wild and wounded. Sarah looked at Grace over the girl's bowed head. Their eyes met, and in that moment, a decision was made without words. "Take her to the medical tent," Sarah said. "I will finish here." Grace helped Mari to her feet and half carried her across the yard. Behind them, the photography session continued. The camera flashed again and again, light capturing faces, faces becoming evidence. Evidence that would travel to places unknown, be seen by eyes unguessed, be used for purposes no one in this camp could control. In the medical tent, Grace eased Mari onto a cot. The girl curled into herself, knees to chest, arms wrapped tight. She rocked slightly and made small, keening sounds that were almost animal. Grace sat beside her and said nothing. Sometimes there were no words. Sometimes all you could do was bear witness. Outside, the session continued for another hour. When it finished, Lieutenant Sarah Parker collected the film canisters personally. Grace watched through the tent opening as Sarah took each one from the photographer, examined it, and placed it carefully into a sealed metal case. Her movements were precise, protective, or possessive. Grace could not tell which. The theft, night fell fast. The camp settled into its usual rhythms. Guards changed shifts. Mess hall prepared dinner. Generators hummed to life, powering lights that pushed back the darkness in small circles of electric yellow. Grace sat with Mari in the barracks. The girl had not spoken since the photograph. She lay on her cot and stared at the canvas ceiling as if answers might be written there in patterns only she could read. Around them, other women whispered. Some played cards. Others mended clothes or wrote letters they knew might never be sent. The war was over, but the world had not yet reformed itself into something recognizable. Grace was dozing head against the barracks wall when the shout came. Male voice, sharp with alarm, from somewhere near the center of the camp. Every woman in the barracks sat up instantly. Old instincts. When soldiers shouted, you paid attention. Grace stood and moved to the entrance. Through the gap in the canvas, she could see guards running toward the medical compound. Their flashlights cut white paths through the darkness. Something was wrong. Grace stepped outside without thinking. Several other women followed, drawn by curiosity or concern or simple need to know what new disaster had arrived. They found a cluster of guards gathered near the medical tent. In the center, an American soldier lay on the ground, one hand pressed to his head. Blood seeped between his fingers, dark and glistening in the lamplight. A medic was already kneeling beside him, checking the wound. The soldier groaned and tried to sit up, but the medic pushed him back down gently. "What happened?" a guard asked. His voice carried across the compound. The wounded soldier's response was slurred but audible. "Was on courier duty, taking the film canisters to the communication office for tomorrow's transport. Someone hit me from behind. Did not see who." "The film?" another guard asked. "Gone. The metal case. Everything." Grace felt her stomach drop. She looked across the yard and found Mari standing just outside the barracks. Even from this distance, Grace could see the terror on the girl's face, because they both understood what this meant. Someone had stolen the photographs. All of them. Every image captured that afternoon. Every face, every identity. Someone who did not want those pictures to leave Camp Stoneheart. Lieutenant Sarah Parker emerged from the medical tent, her hair slightly disheveled, her uniform jacket missing. She looked at the wounded soldier, then at the empty space where the metal case should have been. Her expression was unreadable, but her hands, Grace noticed, had formed into fists. "Search the compound," Sarah said. Her voice was level, cold. "Now." The guards scattered like disturbed birds. Within minutes, the entire camp was awake. Lanterns swung through the darkness. Boots splashed through puddles left by recent rain. Orders were shouted in English. Questions were asked in broken Japanese. The prisoners were ordered to remain in their barracks. Guards posted at every entrance. No one in, no one out. Grace sat on her cot and watched shadows move across the canvas walls. Beside her, Mari had pulled her knees to her chest again. She rocked slowly, her breath coming fast and shallow. "They are looking for me," Mari whispered. "They will find me. You do not know that." Who else? Mari's eyes were wild. Who else would want those photographs destroyed? It was me. They know about me. They know and I saw things I should not have seen. They know I kept records. And now they are coming. Grace wanted to argue, to offer reassurance, but the logic was inescapable. Of 30 women photographed, only one had a secret worth killing for. Only one had a mark hidden beneath healing skin. Only one had copied lists that documented crimes no government wanted exposed. The search continued through the night. Tents were emptied, bags were inspected. Even the prisoners themselves were questioned one by one with translators present about what they had seen, what they knew, whether they had witnessed anything unusual. Grace was questioned. She told the truth as much as she could. She had been in the barracks. She had heard the shout. She knew nothing. When they asked about Mari, Grace said only that the girl had been traumatized by the photography session and had not left her cot since. The guard making notes looked skeptical, but moved on. Mari was questioned last. She answered in monosyllables. Yes, no, I do not know, I saw nothing. The translator relayed her words. The guards exchanged looks but seemed to find nothing suspicious. Just another frightened prisoner in a camp full of frightened prisoners. When dawn finally broke, the film had not been found. The case had vanished as completely as if it had never existed. And Grace began to wonder if maybe Mari was wrong. Maybe this was not about her at all. Maybe someone else in this camp had secrets worth protecting. Maybe more than one person had reasons to destroy evidence. The sabotage. By the end of the week, a new crisis emerged. The supply trucks that usually arrived every 3 days came less frequently. When they did come, they carried fewer crates, less food, fewer medical supplies. The abundance that had confused and comforted the prisoners began to evaporate like morning mist. Breakfast portions shrank. 1 egg instead of 2, a single strip of bacon that looked thin and sad on the metal tray. Bread that was harder, older, rationed more carefully. By the second week, some mornings brought only rice. Thin rice. Almost like what they had eaten during the war. The American guards ate the same rations. Grace noticed that. Whatever was happening, it affected everyone equally. That ruled out deliberate cruelty. This was something else. Lieutenant Parker looked thinner. The soldiers moved with less energy. Even young Tommy Sullivan, who had given them chocolate, now looked hungry himself. On the 15th day of reduced rations, Grace woke to shouting from the supply tent. She dressed quickly and joined the crowd gathering near the storage area. Through the press of bodies, she could see 2 guards crouching over spilled grain. Rice covered the ground in a pale carpet mixed with dirt and small stones. The storage sacks had been sliced open. Every single one, clean cuts through heavy canvas, the kind of precision that spoke of intention rather than accident. A sergeant stood over the mess, his face dark with anger. Animals do not cut canvas, he said to no one in particular. The storage tent was searched. Nothing else appeared to be missing. Just the deliberate destruction of food in a camp that was already running low on supplies. Grace felt a hand on her arm. She turned to find Sarah Parker standing beside her. The lieutenant's face was pale. Her eyes moved constantly, scanning the crowd, the perimeter, the spaces between tents. This was not random, Sarah said quietly, more to herself than to Grace. What do you mean someone is trying to force a situation? Create pressure. Flush out whoever took the film by making everyone desperate enough to trade information for food. Grace absorbed this. You think someone in the camp did this? Sarah's jaw tightened. I think we have 2 different groups operating here. One that wants to protect secrets, one that wants to expose them, and the rest of us are caught between. Which side are you on? Sarah looked at her then, really looked at her. The question hung between them like smoke. I am on the side that keeps people alive, Sarah said finally, but that is getting harder every day. Over the next week, the food situation worsened. Rations dropped to levels barely sufficient for survival. The women grew gaunt. Some of the older prisoners developed symptoms of malnutrition, swollen joints, bleeding gums, the kind of slow deterioration that came from bodies consuming themselves. Grace used her medical knowledge to stretch what little they had. She advised the women on which wild plants growing near the fence line were edible. She showed them how to chew slowly, to drink water, to fill their stomachs, to rest more, to conserve energy. But advice could not replace calories. Knowledge could not substitute for food. One evening, Grace found Sarah standing at the perimeter fence, staring out at the empty road that led to the main highway. The sun was setting, painting everything in shades of amber and rust. Grace approached carefully. They had not spoken directly since the day of the sabotage. "How long can we survive like this?" Grace asked. Sarah did not turn. "Depends. A human can last 3 weeks without food if they have water. But we will not reach 3 weeks. Something will break first." "What will break?" Sarah finally looked at her. "Someone will talk. Someone will trade information for food. That is what whoever did this is counting on." "You think they will come for Mari?" Sarah nodded slowly. "Or I will be ordered to turn her over. Same result." "Will you?" The question hung in the cooling air. From somewhere in the camp came the sound of coughing. Someone was sick. Someone was always sick now. "I served in China," Sarah said abruptly. 1943, I was embedded with Chinese resistance fighters near Kunming. We moved supplies on the Burma Road. Medical supplies mostly, but also intelligence. Grace waited. "I saw things," Sarah continued. "Villages that had been emptied, people who had disappeared, and I took photographs. Documentation. Evidence. My superiors told me to destroy them, said it would complicate diplomatic relations, said it was not our business what happened in China." "Did you destroy them?" Sarah's smile was bitter. "No, I kept them, hid them, sent copies to journalists who would not use them. Because I thought truth mattered. I thought someone should know." She turned to face Grace fully. "That is why I recognize the mark on Mari's leg. Because I have seen the files from the Tokaitai. I know what those units did. I know what records they kept. And I know there are people on both sides who do not want those records to become public. Both sides, Japanese officials who ordered the crimes, American officials who knew and did nothing. Maybe even cooperated. War makes strange partnerships, Grace. And peace makes them even stranger." Grace felt something cold settle in her chest. So the film was stolen by, could be anyone. Someone who wants to protect Japan's reputation. Someone who wants to protect America's. Someone who wants to use the information for blackmail. Or someone who genuinely believes the truth should die with the war. Sarah looked back at the empty road. "But whoever it is, they are willing to starve us to get what they want. That tells me they are serious and desperate, which makes them dangerous. What can we do?" Sarah was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Keep Marie alive. Keep her silent. And hope that whatever is coming, we are ready for it." But her voice held no conviction. And Grace understood why. Because some things you could not prepare for. Some storms arrived without warning and swept away everything in their path. And this storm, Grace knew with certainty, was just beginning, the paper sky. They came like snow in August. White papers drifting down through the California heat, catching sunlight, twisting in currents of air that smelled of dust and sage. They landed on tents, on the shoulders of guards, on the upturned faces of women who had stopped believing in miracles. Grace caught one as it fell. The paper was thin, cheap, the kind used for mass printing when quality did not matter because quantity was everything. On one side English, on the other Japanese. She read the Japanese twice, 3 times. The words did not change. "Japan surrenders. The war is over. Emperor Hirohito has spoken. We must bear the unbearable. We must endure the unendurable." For a moment the world went silent. Not quiet, silent, as if sound itself had stopped existing. Grace could see mouths moving around her, women falling to their knees, guards lowering their rifles. But she heard nothing, just a vast emptiness where noise should have been. Then it all rushed back. A scream, high and ragged, followed by laughter that sounded like breaking glass. Someone sobbing, someone praying. The babble of 30 women processing the end of everything they had known. Grace stood frozen, the paper trembling in her hands. She thought about her father. Missing in Manchuria. Probably dead. Almost certainly dead. But now definitely dead because if he had survived, if he had lived through years of fighting in China, what would he return to? A country burned to ash. An emperor who had spoken the unspeakable. A defeat so total it unmade reality itself. Across the yard, Mari sat in the dirt with a leaflet pressed to her chest. Her eyes were closed. Her lips moved in what might have been prayer or curse, or simply the repetition of words to make them real. "It is finished," Mari whispered when Grace approached. "But not for me. It will never be finished for me." Grace wanted to argue, to say that the end of war meant the end of danger. But she had learned not to lie to this girl who had been lied to enough. Around them, the camp descended into controlled chaos. American officers gathered in tight groups, speaking in urgent tones. Guards watched the prisoners with new uncertainty, as if the categories of enemy and captive had suddenly become meaningless. Radio chatter crackled from the communication tent. Someone was shouting for Colonel Davidson. Lieutenant Sarah Parker stood alone near the medical tent, a leaflet in her hand, her face absolutely expressionless. But Grace saw the way her fingers crushed the paper's edges, the way her jaw worked, as if chewing words too dangerous to speak. Their eyes met across the distance. Sarah gave a single small nod. Not reassurance, just acknowledgement. Whatever was coming would arrive soon. The visitor. Private Tommy Sullivan found Grace 2 hours later. The boy looked different. Older somehow, though only hours had passed since the leaflets fell. His uniform seemed to hang on him differently, as if the war ending had stripped away whatever held him upright. "Ma'am," he said, then stopped. He had never called Grace that before. Ma'am felt wrong in his mouth. Too formal, too distant. Grace waited. Tommy shifted his weight, looked at his boots, looked at the sky. Finally looked at her. "I want you to know," he said carefully, "that not all of us are the same. Some of the men here, they are good men. They tried to do right, even when orders made it hard." Grace nodded slowly. "I know." "What happens next?" Tommy continued. "What they might do. It is not because we want to. It is because someone higher up is making decisions we cannot control." "What is going to happen?" Tommy's face twisted with something between anger and shame. "I should not say, but you have been kind, and that girl Mari, she is in danger. We know. It is worse than you think." Tommy leaned closer, his voice dropping. "There are men coming. Tomorrow. From Washington. They want to take her for questioning. About records. About things she saw in China." Grace's chest tightened. What kind of questioning? The kind that does not end well. The kind where answers matter less than making examples. Tommy pulled something from his pocket. A chocolate bar, slightly melted. He pressed it into Grace's hand. "I am sorry," he said. "For whatever happens, I am sorry." Then he walked away quickly before Grace could respond, before the weight of what he had revealed could settle fully into words. Grace found Sarah in the medical tent. The lieutenant was packing supplies into crates with mechanical precision. Bandages, iodine, morphine ampoules that clinked softly against each other. "They are coming for her," Grace said without preamble. Sarah did not stop packing. "I know. Tomorrow. I know. What will you do?" Sarah's hands finally stilled. She turned to face Grace, and for the first time since they had met, her carefully maintained composure cracked. Just slightly, just enough to reveal the exhaustion beneath. "What I should have done from the beginning," Sarah said. The confession. Sarah poured 2 cups of coffee from a dented percolator. The coffee was terrible, burnt and bitter, but it was hot and it was real, and sometimes that was enough. They sat on supply crates in the medical tent. Outside, the camp had settled into uneasy evening. Tomorrow would bring transport arrangements, repatriation procedures, the slow machinery of processing prisoners back into whatever world would accept them. But tonight there was only the two of them and the truth that could no longer be avoided. "I am not just a nurse," Sarah said. Grace had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed still sent a chill through her. "Army intelligence," Sarah continued. "I was assigned to the medical corps as cover. My real job was to identify Japanese military personnel with sensitive information. People who might be useful for war crimes tribunals, or people who might know things that could embarrass certain parties on both sides." And Mari. Sarah took a long drink of coffee. Mari was flagged before she even arrived here. Someone in Manila recognized her name from captured documents. A junior clerk attached to the Tokatay. Not important enough to be targeted, but potentially useful if she could be convinced to talk. "So you were supposed to interrogate her. I was supposed to identify her, confirm her identity, then hand her over to specialists who would extract whatever information she had. But you did not." Sarah's laugh was hollow. "No, because I saw the mark on her leg and I recognized it. And I remembered China in 1943. I remembered the villages, the photographs I took, the evidence I was ordered to destroy." She set down her cup. I thought I was building a case, collecting proof, making sure that when the trial started, we would have undeniable documentation of what happened. Japanese atrocities, American complicity, all of it. But someone found out. Sarah nodded. Someone in Washington. Someone who does not want certain operations exposed. Someone who knows that if Mari's records match my photographs, there will be questions no one wants to answer. Like what? Like why American intelligence officers were in Manchuria in 1943 taking copies of Japanese war crime documentation. Like why we did not act on that information. Like what deals were made in the shadows while people died in the light. Grace absorbed this slowly, the theft of the film, the sabotage of supplies. It was all connected. They want Mari to disappear, Sarah said, either through starvation that can be blamed on supply chain failures, or through transfer to a black site where no records will be kept. Either way, she vanishes. Her knowledge vanishes. The threat vanishes. What can we do? Sarah stood, paced. Her shadow stretched long across the canvas walls. There is a truck leaving tomorrow at dawn, medical supplies for the San Francisco port. The driver is sympathetic. He has agreed to additional cargo. You are going to smuggle her out. We are going to smuggle her out, Sarah corrected. You, me, Mari, all the evidence I have been hiding. We get to San Francisco, we find journalists who cannot be bought, and we release everything. That is treason. Sarah smiled. It was not a happy expression. Only if we lose. The confrontation. Midnight brought Colonel James Davidson to the medical tent. He arrived without announcement, flanked by 2 armed guards. Grace was there helping Sarah sort through documents. Mari slept fitfully on a cot in the corner. Davidson was a thick man in his mid-40s, hard face, harder eyes, the kind of officer who had climbed ranks by following orders without question and expecting the same from those beneath him. Lieutenant Parker, he said. His voice was flat. We need to talk. Sarah straightened, set down the papers she had been holding. Sir, the prisoner Tanaka Mari, she is being transferred at 0600 hours. Washington has sent orders. She is to be transported to a secure facility for enhanced debriefing. Enhanced debriefing. The words hung in the air like poison. No, Sarah said. Davidson's eyebrows rose. That was not a request, Lieutenant. I understand, sir. And my answer remains no. The guard shifted position, hands moving closer to weapons. Grace felt her pulse kick up. Davidson stepped forward. You are refusing a direct order. I am refusing an illegal order. The prisoner has rights under the Geneva Convention. She is a non-combatant, a clerk. She cannot be subjected to coercive interrogation. Davidson's smile was cold. The war is over, Lieutenant. Geneva Convention does not apply to cleanup operations. Then I resign my commission, effective immediately, and I take Mari with me as a civilian protecting another civilian. Davidson's face darkened. You do not understand what you are protecting. That girl has information that could damage American interests, could compromise intelligence operations that are still ongoing, could endanger lives. She has information that could expose war crimes, Sarah shot back. Crimes committed by Japan and covered up by us. And you want her silenced because the truth is inconvenient. The truth is classified. The truth is the truth, Sarah's voice was steel. It does not change because you stamp it secret. Davidson pulled a pistol from his holster, not pointing it at anyone yet, just holding it, a suggestion of consequence. Stand aside, Lieutenant. That is your final order. Grace moved before thinking. She stepped between Davidson and the cot where Mari slept. Her heart hammered, but her voice came out steady. You will have to shoot a Japanese prisoner of war, she said in careful English. The translator is not here. But she knew Davidson understood the gesture, if not the words. For a long moment, no one moved. The tableau held, colonel and lieutenant and prisoner and guard, all frozen in the amber of decision. Then a voice from the entrance, Sir. Private Tommy Sullivan stood there, rifle in hand, but pointed at the ground. The truck is ready. Medical supplies are loaded. I completed the manifest like you ordered. Davidson turned. What truck? For the transport to San Francisco, sir. The requisition you signed last week. Medical supplies for the repatriation ships. I signed no such thing. Tommy reached into his pocket, pulled out a form. Your signature is right here, sir. See authorized and approved. Davidson snatched the paper, stared at it. The signature was perfect, because Sarah had forged it 3 days ago using letterhead she had stolen from the administrative office. Davidson looked at Tommy, at Sarah, at Grace. Understanding dawned slowly. You are all in this together. Tommy said nothing, just stood there young and scared but holding his ground. Davidson's grip on the pistol tightened. Then slowly he lowered it, put it back in the holster. His face was stone. You are making a mistake, he said to Sarah. All of you. This will not end well. Maybe not, Sarah replied, but at least it will end with the truth. Davidson stared at her for a long moment. Then he turned and walked out. The guards followed, leaving confused glances behind them. Grace realized she had been holding her breath. She let it out in a rush. Tommy looked at Sarah. You have maybe 2 hours. After that, he will call in support from the main base. You need to be gone before then. Why are you helping us? Sarah asked. Tommy's smile was sad. Because I was at Normandy, ma'am. I saw what happens when people just follow orders. I do not want to be that person anymore. He handed Sarah a set of keys. Truck is behind the supply depot, full tank. I marked the route to San Francisco on a map. Avoid checkpoints. Then he left too, and they were alone with the sound of Grace's heart trying to climb out of her chest. Mari sat up on the cot. She had been awake the entire time. We need to move, Sarah said. Now the escape. The truck was older than Grace, maybe older than the war. It coughed and sputtered and smelled like burning oil, but the engine caught on the third try and held. Sarah drove. Grace sat in the middle. Mari pressed against the passenger door, staring out at the camp they were leaving behind. Everything Sarah owned fit in a single duffel bag. Medical supplies, forged documents, and a manila envelope sealed with wax that contained the photographs from China and copies of Mari's lists that Sarah had convinced the girl to recreate from memory over the past weeks. Evidence. Proof. Truth wrapped in paper and hope. They passed through the main gate without incident. The guard on duty was young, probably could not read the falsified transport orders Sarah handed him. He waved them through with barely a glance. Then they were on the highway, heading west toward the coast, toward San Francisco and ships that would carry prisoners back to Japan, toward a future that was impossible to imagine but had to be faced anyway. The drive took 6 hours. Sarah pushed the truck hard, ignoring speed limits, gambling that any patrol car would assume they were military on official business. Grace dozed fitfully. Mari did not sleep at all. Dawn was breaking when they reached the San Francisco port. The city was waking up, milk trucks making deliveries, dock workers heading to morning shifts, the ordinary machinery of peace grinding slowly to life. Sarah parked the truck near the Red Cross Processing Center. Ships lined the harbor, transport vessels being converted back from wartime duty. Grace could see other Japanese prisoners being processed, lines of women waiting for documentation, for passage home, for whatever came next. Sarah turned off the engine. In the sudden silence, all three of them sat without moving. This is where we separate, Sarah said. Mari looked at her. What will you do? I have contacts, journalists, people who will publish the evidence if something happens to me. I will make copies, distribute them, make sure the truth cannot be buried. And if they arrest you, then they arrest me. Sarah's smile was grim, but the truth will already be out there. That is what matters. She reached into her bag and pulled out the manila envelope, handed it to Grace. Take this. Get on a ship. When you reach Japan, find the War Crimes Documentation Center in Tokyo. Give them this. Tell them it came from an American intelligence officer. Tell them everything. Grace took the envelope. It was heavier than it should have been, as if truth had weight that paper alone could not account for. Why trust me? Grace asked. Because you stayed with Mari when no one else would. Because you risked yourself for a girl you barely knew. Because I think you understand what truth costs. Sarah looked at Mari. You can still testify. If you are brave enough. If you think the world deserves to know. Mari's hands trembled, but she nodded. Someone should remember. Someone should say their names. Sarah climbed out of the truck. Grace and Mari followed. They stood in the morning light, three women who had been enemies and captors and prisoners and had somehow become something else entirely. Sarah held out her hand. Grace took it. They shook. An American gesture. But it felt right. Take care of each other, Sarah said. Then she walked away, toward a future that would likely include court-martial and disgrace and possibly prison. But she walked with her head up, shoulders back, as if the truth she carried made her lighter instead of heavier. Grace watched until Sarah disappeared into the morning crowd. Then she took Mari's hand and led her toward the processing line, toward ships, toward home, toward whatever Japan had become in the aftermath of fire, the return. December 1945, the crossing took 2 weeks. Grace stood at the railing and watched Japan emerge from the mist. At first, just a smudge on the horizon, then a shape, then land, then a country that looked nothing like the one she had left. Tokyo Bay was crowded with American ships, occupation forces, relief supplies, the machinery of conquest dressed up as humanitarian aid. The harbor itself was damaged, cranes bent at wrong angles, docks pitted with craters from bombing runs. The city beyond was worse. From the ship, Grace could see block after block of rubble, skeletal buildings with walls standing but nothing behind them, burn patterns on concrete, absence where neighborhoods had been. She thought about the wooden charm in her pocket, her father's last gift. Keep this with you always. It will bring you home. But which home? This broken thing. This shadow of memory. Mari stood beside her, silent. The girl had not spoken much during the crossing. She ate little, slept less. At night, Grace heard her crying softly in the bunk below, trying to muffle the sound with her blanket. They are all dead, Mari had whispered one night. Everyone I knew, everyone I wrote down in those lists, dead or scattered or gone. What is the point of truth when there is no one left to hear it? Grace had no answer, so she just held the girl until the crying stopped. Now watching their destroyed homeland appear through the mist, Grace wondered if Mari was right. What good was evidence when the world had ended? What good were names when the people who bore them had burned to ash? But then she thought about Sarah, about Tommy, about the choices people made, even when choosing meant losing everything. Truth mattered because it mattered. That was the only answer she had. The choice, the War Crimes Documentation Center, was in a partially destroyed office building in central Tokyo. 3 floors that had somehow survived when everything around them fell. American military government insignia hung beside rising sun flags. Occupation dressed up as cooperation. Grace climbed stairs that smelled of mildew and old fires. Mari waited outside. She had chosen not to come in. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Grace understood. The office was small, a desk, filing cabinets, windows that looked out over ruins. A clerk sat at the desk, Japanese, middle-aged. His uniform was civilian, but his bearing was military. Probably a former officer, probably grateful for any work that kept him fed. I have something for the archive, Grace said. The clerk looked up, bored. I mean, what kind of something? Fit as from an American intelligence officer. Records of crimes in Manchuria. The clerk's boredom evaporated. He sat up straighter. May I see, Grace said, the manila envelope on the desk. Watched the clerk open it. Watched his face change as he examined the contents. Photographs, lists in perfect Japanese characters. Names, villages, dates. His hands trembled slightly. Where did you get this? From someone who thought the truth mattered more than orders. The clerk was quiet for a long time. Then, do you know what is in here? Grace nodded. I have seen it. These names, these places. If this becomes public, there will be consequences. Trials, executions, shame that will last generations. I know. The clerk looked at her. Really looked at her. And your father is his name in here? Grace's breath caught. How did you know your face? When I read the lists, I saw recognition, saw pain. So I will ask you again, knowing what this will do, knowing what it will mean for your family. Do you still want me to archive this? Grace thought about her father, about the wooden charm, about prayers whispered over dying men, about the weight of mercy and the price of truth. She thought about Mari waiting outside, about Sarah who had given up everything, about Tommy who had chosen kindness over orders. She thought about villages that were no longer names on a map, about people who had become numbers in a ledger, about crimes committed in the name of empire and honor, and all the words men used when they meant power and blood. Yes, Grace said. Archive it. The clerk nodded slowly. Then it will be done. Your name will not be attached. This will be listed as recovered documents. Source unknown. Thank you. The clerk began to reseal the envelope. Then he paused. There is something you should know. The American officer who gave you this, Lieutenant Sarah Parker. Grace's heart clenched. What about her? She was arrested 3 days after reaching San Francisco, court-martialed for treason, theft of classified materials, aiding enemy personnel. Grace felt her world tilt, and the trial was brief. She was found guilty, sentenced to 10 years military prison. Grace closed her eyes, in years. But the clerk continued. There is more. The documents she tried to publish, the evidence she tried to release. It disappeared. All copies confiscated, destroyed, as if they never existed. Except Grace said quietly, they do exist, because I brought them here. The clerk smiled. It was small and sounded real. Except they exist. Yes. The wait. Grace worked as a midwife in the ruins of Tokyo. She delivered babies in buildings with no roofs. She taught mothers to nurse with bodies that produced little milk because food was scarce and hope was scarcer. She lived in a single room that smelled of char and dampness and refused to collapse despite having every reason to give up. Mari vanished into the chaos. No note, no goodbye, just absence where a person had been. Grace looked for her sometimes, asked around. But Mari had been a ghost even when present. Now she was simply gone. Years passed. Grace married a school teacher, a quiet man who asked no questions about the war. They had children, 2 daughters who grew up in a Japan that was rebuilding itself into something new and strange and undeniably alive. Grace kept the wooden charm. She never told her husband about her father, about the names she had seen in the lists, about the choice she had made in that small office overlooking ruins. Some truths were too heavy to share. In 1947, rumors reached her. Mari Tanaka found dead in Osaka, circumstances unclear, possibly suicide, possibly something else. Grace attended no funeral because there was none. Just another name added to the long roll of people the war had killed years after the fighting stopped. In 1963, a letter arrived from America, from someone who signed it only as a friend. The letter was brief. Sarah Parker released from prison after serving full sentence. Health poor, living in California, working with veterans trying to process what they had done and seen. She asked about you. She wanted you to know she does not regret it. Grace burned the letter, but she remembered every word. The witness. 40 years after the war ended, Grace sat in a small Tokyo apartment that looked out over a city rebuilt so completely it seemed to deny its own past. Neon lights where fires had burned, steel and glass where rubble had been. A granddaughter 16 years old doing homework at the kitchen table. The girl looked up. "Grandmother, I have a question." Grace smiled. "Of course. My history class is studying the war. About the things Japan did. The teacher said many records were destroyed, that we will never know the full truth." Grace was quiet for a moment. Then she stood and went to a small box she had kept in the closet. Inside were few things. The wooden charm, a photograph, yellow with age, creased from handling. She gave the photograph to her granddaughter. The image showed 30 women standing in California dust, barefoot, afraid, but alive. "That is you." The girl's eyes were wide. Grace nodded. "They made us show our legs, to check for disease. We thought they would hurt us, but they healed us instead." "Did you forgive them?" Grace considered. "They did not ask for forgiveness. They gave us something harder to carry. What mercy? And the knowledge that truth has a price." "What price?" Sometimes Grace said quietly, "The name you fear most is your own." The girl did not understand, not yet, but someday she would, when she was older, when she had lived enough to know that the hardest truths are the ones that live in your own blood. Grace looked out at the bright city. Somewhere in California, if she was still alive, Sarah Parker was looking at a different city, different lights, different ruins rebuilt. And somewhere in archives that few people consulted were lists written in perfect characters, names of villages, names of perpetrators, names that included Nakamura Hiroshi, father, soldier, man who had done things that could not be undone. Grace touched the wooden charm. It was worn smooth, almost formless now, but still real. still present, like memory, like truth. The war ended in 1945, she said to her granddaughter. But for three women who knew the truth, it never really stopped. Outside the city hummed with life. Inside, an old woman and a young girl sat in comfortable silence. And in the space between them lay all the weight of mercy and truth and the terrible, beautiful burden of survival.